Anybody that's hunting like the classic bass tone you've all heard 1,000 times, it's an 8x10 SVT Ampeg amp. Save your time. That's all you need to hear.
Yeah.
But there's cooler ways than that to really get modern bass tones.
This is the Self-Recording Band Podcast, the show where we help you make exciting records on your own, wherever you are, DIY style. Let's go. Hello and welcome to the Self-Recording Band Podcast. I am your host, Benedict Hein, and I'm here with my friend and co-host, Malcolm Owen Flood. How are you, Malcolm?
Hello. I'm great, man. Thank you. Just had a wicked weekend. Ate a lot of red meat on the barbecue. So things are good.
So, still summer weather in Canada?
Yeah. It was nice and clear over the weekend. So we had some forest fire smoke. If anybody listened in last week, we talked about that a little bit, and it cleared up. So it was like kind of back to being outside and stuff. It was nice.
Oh, that sounds perfect.
Yeah. How about you, man?
Awesome. I was at a meetup at the URM Meetup at Christian Kuhlmannsliner's place. So I don't know if you know him. If you're listening, you probably do. If you don't know him, he's a very successful, very well-known metal producer in Germany. And we had a meetup there with a lot of cool people, about 25 people, I think. And we got a studio tour, and we hung out at his place, and then we went to a restaurant and spent the evening there, and I got to talk to a lot of amazing people. Some of them even, I found out that some of them are listening to the show, which is cool. So,
cool.
Yeah, I got to meet a lot of cool people here. Had a wonderful weekend. And yeah, I just got out of the car driving back from that meeting. And yeah, it was awesome.
Right on. I wish I could have been there for that. That would have been cool.
Yeah, it was totally cool. Shout out to Christian Kohle for hosting this. He was a fantastic host and so like a fun person to hang with. And that goes for everyone else there. So yeah, it was really amazing.
Awesome. Yeah, his stuff's great. I definitely think I would have enjoyed that.
Yeah, man, and his live room, I saw it on the internet, of course, a couple of times, but being in there, it's such a cool concept because it's actually a pretty small room. Like, it's high, but it's not super, the width and length are not too big, but it's pretty high, and it has a fantastic room sound, although it's not too big of a room. And it was
dimensions. That's the word.
yeah. And it was designed by Northwood Acoustics, and they do some crazy room designs, mostly mastering studios these days. You should look that up. I will put a link in the show notes because it's spectacular. It's fantastic what they do, and they're one of the, I think, most expensive but also best designers of mastering studios around the world. They do I think they did Sterling and like the really big mastering houses, and and a couple of years ago, they did Kohle's Live Room. One of them is, I think Thomas is his name, who's running the company. He's a metal and hardcore fan, and he said, yeah, I haven't done a live room in a while, so why not? Sounds like fun. So he designed that room for Kohle, and he had talked to us about it and explained the process, and it's just crazy how much detail work and how much precision was involved there, and the room is just spectacular. It's nothing nothing more to say here. It's really amazing. So if you ever get the chance to visit that place, or if there's a meetup again, or if you can, whatever, just
ever
do it.
Fly to Germany?
Yeah, super awesome. Anyway, had a lot of fun. Was a cool meetup. Great weekend. And yeah, now I'm back.
Well, we should jump into our episode.
Totally. Today's episode is actually, usually we're not so much about gear, but today's episode will be partly gear talk because it's about capturing bass, and it's about the different ways you can capture bass tones. So it's about the different approaches, and we're going to talk about what gear to use, when to use what, and we also are going to talk about why or when those approaches make sense and why. So we're going to explain a little bit why we like to get certain types of signals recorded from people that we work with. And what we do with those signals in the mix so that you can better understand why you should do or you can do certain things. I think it makes a lot of sense in this case because you might be confused if someone tells you that they usually use 3 different bass signals and you probably don't know why that is or why you should put in the effort and do that. And we're going to talk about that. We're going to explain our process. We're going to talk about our personal preferences, and we're going to give you some recommendations depending on the sound you're going for, which type of equipment to use and why.
Yeah, there's a lot of different ways to get not the same result, but good results. So like we actually don't know going into this conversation, which is fun, like how I mix and put together bass tone versus Benny. I'm not actually sure how you like to do it versus how I like to do it. So there might be differences, but I do know other engineers who do it totally different than I do, and they still get good results. So we're going to kind of run down different ways that you might want to experiment with trying, but ideally you're going to probably find something that works for you specifically.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sure there are differences between Malcolm and myself and how we approach things, even though we kind of work on similar genres. But there's a difference between like rock and metal and punk and also personal preference and taste, of course. So I'm very curious to hear Malcolm's approaches. And yeah, let's start with like talking about what kind of ways there actually are to capture a bass.
Yeah. Okay. So first up, DI is like the obvious thing to mention, and probably the most common way of just tracking bass out there. A lot of people just don't even bother setting up an amp and throw a DI out there, get a good capture of the bass, and honestly, that's great. Like that will work. You can that will not stop you from having an awesome sounding record as long as that DI capture is great. So some of the advantages there of the DI is that it's like the cleanest signal. It's going to be very versatile in post-production. It's just like, this is what the bass sounds like, period. And then it's also easy to monitor. I think it's worth mentioning. I've kind of got two minds about this. It's easy to monitor in that there's no like distortion or effects hiding the performance. So you're really hearing what's being played, and it's not going to hide anything like that. And the pitch is going to be really easy to pick out. But my the other thought I have on that is that it doesn't. If you're meant to have like a really weird bass tone, this doesn't like represent that. I like making decisions along the way. So if it's going to be a big fuzzy bass tone and it sounds like a clean jazz bass, that's a little weird, and then you're not going to really be able to make like creative decisions based on that. There's kind of fine lines with this, but anyways, it definitely can be nice to have a clean bass tone to reference at the same time. And that's not to say, we should mention right now out of the gate that you can do all of these things we're going to talk about. You don't have to just do one.
Yes, totally.
Yeah. Anything you want to mention about DIs?
For now, I don't think so. I will go back to it later when we talk about why we use those things. For now, I just think a DI is basically mandatory. It's like, it's not optional for me. It's like, I always want a DI. Even if someone really commits to a bass tone and they want a certain bass tone, it doesn't hurt to just, in addition, like record the DI. It's pretty easy to do. We've already talked about that. Just split the signal, use a DI box, or if you're recording directly to your interface, you already have the DI anyway. So just record a DI. You never know. Sometimes, even if the bass tone is set and you really want your bass tone, adding the clean low end of the DI, or like, sometimes you just need it and it's there. So if at all possible, I always want a DI. That's all I want to say right now.
Yeah, actually, I like that the DI is mandatory.
Yeah.
That's definitely, that's the way to put it.
Yeah.
Just do that.
Do that. Absolutely. Absolutely. And we go back to why that is and what we do with the DI so you better understand. Maybe one thing to add to it is not like those specifics that we're going to talk about later, but just if you record a DI, record it as clean as possible. So make sure it doesn't clip. Make sure you're using the right type of DI box. So don't use an active DI with a very high output active bass that will clip or distort, cause the DI to distort. Be very careful with that, because in many cases you want a pretty clean DI so that you can do all the things with it that we're going to talk about later. Mm-hmm. Whenever there's a lot of low end involved and you want big and clean low end, you need the headroom and you don't want it to distort and clip.
Right.
So that's the only thing. And then not to confuse it with the second thing on our list here, the amp out. So you're using an amp without a speaker and you're recording the output of the amp. That's also sometimes called a DI, because some manufacturers call it DI out on the amp, but that's not the real DI that we are talking about here, because the clean DI that we were talking about is the signal right out of your instrument. The amp DI out is after the signal went through the amp. And that can mean right after the input. So it could be that it's just the input stage of the amp coloring the signal, or it could be post the EQ and the compressor or whatever is in the amp, like right before it goes to the power amp. And if that's the case, it can be heavily colored, of course, and you basically record the amp tone just without a cap. So that's not as versatile as the clean DI out of the instrument. But it's still, if you have the inputs and it's easy to just plug a cable in there and record it, why not? I mean, you can do it. It's an easy way. You can get a great tone just from that. And you can record it in addition to the clean DI.
It's curious that, like, so many bass amps, most bass amps, it seems, has this option, post DI, but no guitar amps do.
They really do. I think part of the reason is that I might be wrong here, but I was just thinking that transistor bass amps are much more popular than transistor guitar amps, and you can run a transistor amp without a cap, without destroying it.
Right.
Whereas a guitar, it needs, like, a guitar amp needs to be either designed to do that, some can do that, or you need a load box or a cap in order to do it. That may be part of the reason. The second reason is that with a guitar, you really need the speaker, or at least the speaker simulation. So if a guitar amp has that, if a guitar amp has a DI out, there needs to be some sort of speaker simulation, or it just won't sound like a guitar amp. And with a bass, you don't necessarily need that. The bass can work, like just the line out or the DI out without a cap sim can work. So that's maybe another reason for that.
So I think, maybe I'm wrong on this, but my assumption has always been that DIs for bass came into popularity actually to avoid bleed in the studio, because bands used to track live more often, and bass amps just had this terrible habit of leaking into everything and eating up all your low end. So the solution came just to record a DI, no amp, and the bass player's in the room playing with them, but there's zero bleed. It's great. And that's totally true. Now, in those situations, I could see the amp out being a real great thing, because now you've got amp tone, quotation marks on that, and still no bleed, you know, and you can kind of get like a more live sound that way.
That and the other way around on stage, because if you want to mic a bass on stage and you want to boost a bunch of low end, or you want to compress it heavily or something, then everything else on stage will bleed into that mic, and you might get feedback, even especially if you're boosting a bunch of low end and then compress it and stuff. But if you just take the DI out, you can do whatever you want with it live. So I think having the DI on the board live is much easier and more convenient than miking a bass. So that might also be that might also be it, like the bleed in both directions. Totally.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay. And then last but not least, you can of course mic up an amp, like you would think to do in the first place. So you've got a bass amp running into some speakers, and then you're actually throwing mics on that. And we should mention that's like really the only way to get a room sound on a bass tone, other than, I guess, some kind of IR simulation kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But really, this is the only way to do it. And that's not even, I should also mention, that's not something you normally are going for. At least I'm not normally going for. But occasionally, I do want that. Yeah. And this is the way I get it.
This is the way you get it. At least a realistic kind of room sound. There is another thing I like to do to make the bass a little wider, because bass is usually mono and very direct and not like roomy. There is some things I like to do to make it a little wider and a little more realistic, sort of. But I'll get to that later. And I don't use the mic for that. But yeah, if you want a realistic room sound, the mic is the only way. It will capture part of the room, and especially the low end will be, like most rooms, even if they're treated, the low end is still pretty as it is most of the times, because most people cannot treat their rooms in a way that the low end is very controlled. So you'll get a bunch of low end reflections, and it will color the sound. And if that's what you want, if that is part of the signal, then the mic is the only option. Right. And also, of course, you get the color and the tone of the cap if you do that, because that also obviously affects the tone. And there is a huge difference if you are using, whether you're using like a 15 or an 4x10 or 8x10, or like the various cabs and the various manufacturers. If it's a ported cab or a closed cab, all these things make a huge difference. So if you want a certain characteristic of a certain bass cab, certain bass speaker, then of course that's the only way to get it, other than IRs.
Right. Yeah. And so we've mentioned DIs, amp DIs. I don't know what we want to call that. Post amp.
Yeah.
and then miking. And we do want to just mention that we're going to talk about like amp sims as well. But that kind of falls into DIs really, because they're just being applied to the DI.
Yes.
But that is the ways of capturing a bass right there.
Yes.
Either grabbing a DI, grabbing it out of the amp, or miking it up.
Yes. And also the amp sim, the choice of amp sim is like the same principles apply when like choosing an amp in the real world. So we're going to talk about which amps we like for certain things. So and the same thing is just true for the digital emulations of those. So yeah. All right. Let's start with the different types of the general types of sounds there are and like what we do to get those. So when I'm thinking bass tone for like the various genres that I do in the rock world, there is one thing that sometimes is the right thing to do is a pretty clean, big sound with a full low end, pretty clean. You have a defined pick attack, but not too dirty, like a very clean, transparent sound with a big low end. That's one thing. The opposite is a very mid-rangey, almost guitar-like sound. That's a little thinner on the bottom sometimes. That's a little dirtier, not as precise. And then there is kind of a mix of those two, which is the kind of modern, heavy tone where you have the big low end, but you have also the grit in the mid-range, and you have the distortion, and you have this, I don't know how to describe it, this metallic kind of crystal clear piano note sort of sound that comes from strings partly, but also from using the right amp. So those three things in general are, and everything in between, of course, are what I usually use. And there are different ways to get there. I don't know if what's in your like the rock world and where you typically are. Is there a go-to or?
Yeah, so I think luckily you and I have a similar idea of what we like that. In that the bass tones you just described are generally what I'm aiming for as well. But what's going to be cool is that I'm sure we get there via different methods. So we're kind of aiming for the same goal, but we're going to have different ways of getting there, I'm sure.
Yeah.
But like for me, it's generally, I really love dirty bass tones, and I find that they can work even in softer music. Somehow it always seems to work.
Yeah.
Less distortion, the softer I go, obviously, but you'd be amazed if somebody soloed my bass stems at how dirty I managed to get things without it being noticed, I guess.
Yeah.
So yeah, for me, like the bass tone in my head that I always want to hear is like if somebody was hitting the lowest string on a piano with a drumstick. And that
yeah,
just
exactly.
Like this ginormous blah.
Yeah.
And that's what I want.
Totally. With various degrees of distortion depending on the genre, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So if a band walked into your studio today and you were going to record bass, what would you probably set up?
So first of all, I would have a conversation what they would are going for. So what we're going to do, and let's just talk about some different scenarios. When if a band wants the thing that I like most, which is a pretty dirty, as you just described it, pretty dirty bass tone, with the mid-range grit and the right amount of growl, a little distortion, full low end but not too boomy, like a tight low end but still like with some weight. I would go for I absolutely track a DI, as I said. I always do that. And then I would probably, with most modern things at least, I would probably set up some sort of distortion pedal. Could be a dark glass pedal, could be a Sans amp, could be something like that. I would run that into a pretty clean amp. So it could be a Class D power amp or some modern bass amp. And then I would mic an 8x10 cab. I like those the most for various reasons. And I would combine the DI with that amp tone. And maybe I would, in addition, take the DI out of the distortion pedal. Like I would take the Sans amp or the dark glass DI. Right. I don't like amp DIs as much, but the reason for that is not that I don't like the sound. It's just that some DIs don't work properly or sound weird or sometimes clip, or I don't know. I had some amps with like weird DI outs, especially some of the Ampac amps that I usually pretty much like. So if I want to get more of a dirty sound out of the amp itself without a pedal or with just a little boost or something, I like the old tube Ampac amps. They are just amazing. But I never really like the DI out of those, so I take the DI out before the amp usually. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm the same. Yeah, we should just clear it up. Anybody that's hunting like the classic bass tone you've all heard 1,000 times, it's an 8x10 SVT Ampeg amp.
Totally.
And that's just like the classic that has a sound. It really does work. And if you're looking for that, that's just how you get it. So
Totally. Yeah.
Save your time. That's all you need to hear.
Yeah.
But there's cooler ways than that to really get aggressive modern bass tones.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of like you. There's always going to be a DI, and then I would probably also have that going. These days, I gotta say, my Kemper is like my favorite bass amp in the world.
Yes.
I reamp through that all the time for mixes I do as well. It's just like my instant make things sound like, but again, it makes it sound like an SVT, honestly.
Yeah.
So that I'm always hunting that as a starting point, it seems. But it's what I want to like kind of draw attention to is that both yourself and I are going to have more than one capture going on.
Yeah.
We're going to have our DI and a distortion capture. So same thing as you. If the band comes in and they've got some cool fuzz pedals or something, I'm probably going to be using them in addition to a clean DI. Sometimes it's like literally I'll grab the bass into the clean DI and run the split from that DI into the bass pedals into another DI. So I've just got like a dry DI and a wet DI, and there is still no amp. That might even come up.
Yeah.
I definitely don't gravitate to amps.
No. And that's the reason why I'm saying, even though I love the SVTs and I love the Ampacs, and I played one live for a couple of years, and I still use them and I like them. But that's why I said I use typically just a clean Class D transistor power amp, because I like to have control when it comes to recording bass. So I want the DI that I can always use in reamp, and I will sometimes use an SVT that I reamp through, or a simulation of that I'll add to everything I just said for the mid-range and the character that these amps have. But I want the DI, the clean DI for the low end, so I'll just blend that in to get a massive low end that's just clean and just big, because it always gets smaller when you compress and distort it. So I just want a clean, big low end. I'll blend that with the drive and the pick attack that I get from the clarity that I get from something like the Dark Glass or the Sense Amp, these preamps and their distortion. I get the realism and the tone of the 8x10 that I really love from the mic. And then the dirt and the character I get from sometimes blending a simulation of an SVT, for example. Right. And running through the SVT while recording, I do that sometimes as well, but only if I really know that that's the tone I want to get, because those amps are just so colored and there's less control. And if I want to have a very precise pick attack and a very big low end, that might not be the best choice. But if I want a really dirty, classic bass tone and I want to drive the amp a bit, I will absolutely use an SVT as well. But usually I like the control, and those pedals can do almost anything for me. And the power amp is really just to drive the speaker. That's the way I see it usually. And then if I decide in the mix that I want the SVT tone, then I just reamp it and blend it in.
So we're pretty similar on that then. We both really place a lot of importance on having a DI capture. But then we also want to get, like, we want to be listening to something that is close to the end goal. So we're committing some distortion onto other channels. I do that, again, usually through a Kemper or like a colored DI rather than an amp. So I'd say most of the time I don't set up an amp, actually. I just rarely, I just don't use it enough.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
And the only time I really end up throwing up an amp is if somebody comes in and they have a sound. They've really built a tone for themselves, and that's what they're hoping to use. So they've got, like, after Royal Blood came out, everything changed in the bass world. I don't know if anybody's heard them, but it's like just like over the top fuzz bass kind of thing, with octave pedals and all sorts of stuff. So when those bands come in, I'm going to capture their amps, of course. Yeah. But I still usually end up using that DI to kind of recreate what we were going for. Yeah. So amps aren't really my thing in the bass world, but it's still fun to capture, and you totally can use them. there's more to go wrong in capturing a bass via the amp with mics because of like low end buildup in a room and stuff like that than there is via the DI and preamp, sans amp, dark glass, like you mentioned. Like that approach is way easier to control. So I think for like a self-recording band, you should look into that area. I think that's like a safe play.
Yeah. At this point, to give some recommendations, I would say if you are mainly, or if you like are recording and rehearsing and you're not buying an amp for the stage to play live, I wouldn't even bother buying an amp at all, to be honest. Just like Malcolm described, I would buy a great instrument. That's the first thing. I would buy a great bass, the right bass for your type of sound. Then I would look into amp sims, and I would look into preamps and pedals if you want some flavor, some character, some type of distortion. And a quality DI input, like could be a quality DI box or the input of your interface if that's good. I would focus on that, on the recording chain, and go directly in, and I wouldn't even look into amps, because the good amps cost a lot of money and you could spend that in other areas that will do much more for you. If you're looking for something that you can also use live and you want to play with you want to experiment with recording an amp, then I would say if a big low end, clean low end and clarity is your goal, go with something modern, transistor, Class D, power amp sort of thing, because those have a lot of headroom. They are really loud. It's like the same type of power amp that's in the camper as well. If you have a camper with the power amp, they don't really have a sound. The sound comes from the preamp and the pedals and everything before it. They just amplify the signal. They are loud and clean and have headroom. You can play big stages with them if they have enough power. So if that's what you're looking for, you can use that, and then you're just free to do whatever you want before the amp. If you're going for the classic rock tone and you want some, it's more of a one-trick pony, but if you want like more dirt, more grit, if you are okay with the fact that it just distorts a bit whenever you turn it up loud, the headroom it doesn't have as much headroom, and you don't need the super big, super clean low end and clarity, then go with something like an Ampeg or a Fender Bassman or like the classic bass tube amps or a V4. Yeah. The Ampeg V4 is a pretty affordable, relatively affordable bass tube amp that sounds great, but it has only, which is not much in bass world, it has only 100 watts, I think. So to reproduce low end, you need more power than you need to reproduce a guitar mid-range signal. So the 100-watt tube bass amp will be loud, but it will distort when it's loud. So It has a sound, it has character. It's a great amp, but it's not as versatile. So again, mid-rangey, dirty, rock sound, Ampeg or any sort of tube amp, clarity, big low end, flexibility, and high volumes that are still clean. Go with a transistor amp and put a pedal in front of it. And if you're just recording, don't do anything at all. Just focus on the recording chain without an amp.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Bass live gear is kind of like a different subject than recording gear. They shouldn't be considered the same thing necessarily.
Yes. I just want to mention it because I think there are two camps here. Some people are in a band and want to have one thing to do both. Others are just at home recording for themselves, so the amp is not really relevant. So yeah, totally. Definitely worth mentioning. Yeah.
So we should talk about how we put these things together, probably, because we both said that we like to do multiple captures. So we need to describe how we get it to that, like the end result. And by doing that, we're hoping to give you listeners an idea of like kind of how you could use these tools as well, and kind of different workflows that might appeal to you, just so you understand why. Pretty much just so you understand why it's so important to have a DI. That's really what it's going to come down to. Go ahead. I'm curious. I mean, okay. I always like to hear different approaches, and I'm curious to hear how you do it, especially because the whole using multiple bass sources, bass sounds, is, at least as far as I know, is kind of a typical metal thing or more a modern approach to processing bass. And you are more in the rock world, not so much the very heavy stuff, but you still do some of these things. So I'm curious when and how you use it. Okay, so I usually don't actually use multiples. Okay. I capture multiples. And like I said, we want the clean DI, but I really like hearing what we're going for. So I try and dial that in, be it with the Kemper or be it with the amp, be it with a pedal chain or whatever. But there's always both. And then I'm normally monitoring that amp quotation marks tone, because that is what we were going for. And then come mix, I kind of just make a decision. Like when I mix, I start with drums and then I bring in the bass, and I'm gonna just kind of A/B. And if I'm like feeling really good about the amp sound that we have, I'm gonna mix with that. But if I'm not, I'm gonna grab that DI and make it sound like an amp, kind of thing. And where I do go kind of modern and metal, steal tricks from the metal guys, is that I do some like kind of parallel processing where I split the tone of that source. But I think, unlike you, Benny, I could be wrong because you haven't really got into your method. I'm not actually using both signals at the same time. So I'm not using the DI for the low end and the amp for the top end kind of thing. I'm not splitting it that way. I am just splitting it in the sense that if I had a DI, I am only distorting the top end and not the low end kind of thing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. So in 9 out of 10 times, I end up with just choosing one of the sources and then going, for lack of a better word, ape shit on it until it sounds the way I want. So for me, like we said, we really both like distorted bass kind of thing. So I use a tool called Saturn, and that lets me split it and just like pretty much distort the harmonics and really go nuts on the like upper mid range and stuff like that, while keeping my low end on the cleaner side. That's kind of usually how I get there, is a tool like that, plus a lot of other stuff. But like that's kind of my main tone shaping tool when it comes to bass.
Cool. That's not so different from what I do. You just do it on one track basically with a certain tool. But the idea behind it is similar. So what I do is I actually use at least 2, most of the time 3 different signals and blend them together, and they all end up on a bass master or bass bus or whatever. So cool. And what I do is I take the bass amp sound, or something that we committed to that is as close as possible to what we want. So I always track something like that usually. So could be an amp sim that I was recording through, could be a real amp, could be the setup that I just described, the mic in front of a cab. Just something that represents the bass tone as a whole as much as possible. I start with that. Yeah, the committed bass tone, exactly. I start with that. And then usually in the most of the time in modern or heavy genres, or also in punk rock sometimes, in the genres that I do generally, I want a little more low end, and especially I want more low end than the very distorted signal gives me, because if you distort the whole bass signal, the signal as a whole, including the low end will get a little smaller. It will be tight, but it will be a little smaller. You don't have the clean, big low end anymore if you do that. And also, I want consistency in the low end. That's even more important than the size or the massive low end in these genres, at least in punk rock. In metal and modern metal, you need the size as well, but in punk rock, you don't need a massive bass, but you need a consistent low end, so that when they play, when they go up higher on the bass, or they play like fast bass lines and stuff, I want the low end to be consistent. I don't want it to jump out and then disappear again, depending on what they play. And what I do to get there is I take the DI, and I duplicate the DI track, and then I put a high pass and a low pass. So I put a high pass on one of the DI tracks and the low pass on the other DI tracks, usually around 200 to 300 hertz. So I split the DI up into lows and then mid-range and highs.
Yeah.
With the low pass and high pass at the same frequency with the same slope, usually in linear phase mode, even, so that when they're combined, it's the exact same signal as if you would have just one DI. I leave the lower part of the DI, so I'll call that bass low, and I leave that clean and just compress it as hard as I can without distorting it. So I use a very clean plug-in compressor like the FabFilter C2 or something like that. I find the cleanest setting possible, and I compress it as much as possible so that I have a very consistent low end. Then I blend that with the committed bass track and see how that sounds. And then I take the other part of the split DI signal, which is the mid-range and the top end, and I will add distortion to it, or I will bring out the pick attack, or whatever I like about the signal, or whatever I feel the original bass tone is lacking, and I'll blend that in. So most of the time I end up with one track, the real amp track, that is kind of the character, the mid-range, and what the amp sounds like, and the stuff that cuts through. And then I will have a low track that fills in the low end, and then I will have the high track that usually does the piano type like sound and some pick attack and some clarity, and that's what I basically do. That's how I approach bass recording. And if I only have the DI, I will have the two splitted DI tracks. So one is dirty and distorted and has a lot of top end and definition and pick attack. One is the low end. And then I will duplicate it once more, so I have a third DI track. And I will run that through an amp sim that gives me the character I want. So I will run that through an amp pack or whatever I have and do the same thing.
Yeah. I should mention that I do something similar in that I often duplicate my DI track as well and do something different to it. So often that might be like, say I do that thing with my main DI where I throw Saturn on it and split it so that I'm just distorting the top end, but I don't go too far. It's kind of like just turning it into kind of a normal rock tone, but I really want it to be extra gnarly for this song or whatever. I'll duplicate it and like throw the Pro Tools has a free SansAmp plugin that comes with it, and it's actually pretty awesome for distorting stuff. It's really ugly sounding, so just go nuts with that, and then I've got like this totally distorted, crazy track that I can just kind of mix in there. With my like kind of amp sound quotation marks. That's if all I have is a DI. It's kind of, you got to like build it in chunks, you know. And I'll do the same as you. I'll cut out all the lows on that track because I don't want that getting messed up. I want that to be more pure.
Yeah, totally. And so that people know why that is, why we do that. Again, whenever you want a lot of drive and character and overdrive and distortion out of a bass, the low end will become smaller and you lose definition. You lose the pick attack clarity. So the biggest and cleanest sounding thing you get is an undistorted bass tone with a clear pick attack or finger attack, depending on how you play, and a big low end that's undistorted that will sound massive and full and round. And whenever you get a lot of distortion going or overdrive going or use a tube amp or anything, it will sound cool, but it will become smaller. And using those additional tracks is a way to work around that. So I'll add in the lost low end and I'll add in the lost clarity with the top end DI track, so I can have my dirty sound and still keep the massive low end or the right amount of low end and the consistency, and still have the defined pick attack. So sometimes I don't go crazy with the distortion on the upper DI track, but I'll add something like Decapitator, turn the tone knob to the right so it's a little brighter. We'll add some distortion, but I still aim to keep the clarity.
Right.
Yeah, and maybe boost some highs or upper mid-range. So I'll just fill in what gets lost when you really go crazy on a bass signal. That's the purpose behind it. And that's why I always want the DI, because sometimes people can come up with pretty cool bass sounds, but they are just lacking in one of these areas. Or sometimes they use pedals that sound really cool, but a lot of bass distortion pedals totally kill the low end. There are some pedals that sound amazing, but you will have no low end after it. Or some people like to use a tube screamer on bass. Can sound amazing, not just for guitar, but if you use a tube screamer on bass, the low end is gone, basically. And if I want to have some size in the mix, I need the DI to do that.
That's absolutely right. Is as soon as you have like this fuzzed out bass amp capture, the low end is really lacking. So the DI is our like secret weapon to bring that back. That is the goal. We want both, and so these are just kind of clever ways to get it. It's not too hard, but you do have to experiment and get good at this, and figure out like how much you can get away with and how you can make it still sound cohesive. I think that's something I struggled with when I first started trying to distort just like the higher mid-range on bass, is like making it sound like it's attached to that low end. It's not its own separate instrument kind of thing. And really just trial and error gets you there, I think.
Totally.
Just,
Totally, yeah. I think that's part of the challenge here, and that's why some people don't like that technique. It's not a thing that you have to do. A lot of people these days do it, the bass splitting and all what we've been talking about, but some people, it doesn't work for some people. When, for example, we've mentioned it before, Billy Decker, the country mixer, we've been talking about the legendary country mixer we've been talking about a couple of times now. He does metal occasionally. He loves to mix metal, actually, although his main thing he's known for is country, but he can mix metal very well, actually. And he's tried the splitting bass thing, and it just never works for him. Throughout his whole career, all he used was one bass track, and he just processes it the way that it works for the song. And he's been trying to do the metal bass splitting technique thing, and it just doesn't work. So he just went back to doing what he knows best, and it works. Right. So his metal mixes still sound great, even though he doesn't do these things. So as always, it comes down to personal preference. But yeah, it's a pretty well established technique now. So, and most people will want you to record a DI for those reasons. And I even go further than that. On my bass bus, after I put those signals together, I will most of the time have a multiband compressor and again compress the low end to make it even more consistent and to bring it together, the lower mid-range of the amp with the low end of the DI track. It just kind of glues it together more and makes it even more consistent. I also use a band of that multiband compressor to control the pick attack and the clickiness, because that can go pretty crazy sometimes depending on how consistent the player is. So I will have one band controlling the 2K area or something.
Nice.
And I do that on the bass bus. And then after I do that, I compress the whole thing maybe, and maybe use a sidechain filter to leave the low end alone. So there can be multiple stages of compression after that, even to bring it together, to bring it back together and make it one signal again. So,
yes. Yeah, that is really important. Just, again, going back to making it cohesive and sound like the distortion is attached to that low end. It is the same instrument, is summing it back together in a way that kind of communicates properly. I spend a lot of time doing that as well. But, yeah, I mean, we should... just want to talk a little bit about if you're not splitting, because I do that as well. It happens, and like pretty much it's just whatever works. It's mixing, right? So you listen to it and you want it dirtier, I just make it dirtier, and if it still seems like there's enough low end, I'm not going to bother going through this whole thing just because it works most of the time. If it sounds right, I'm going to just leave it.
Yeah, I mean, I've received bass tracks that were recorded so well that I don't do anything to them other than maybe a touch of compression or some filtering or subtle EQ. I mean, if someone wants a classic rock tone and they recorded, let's say, a precision bass with the right strings, and they have great playing technique and consistency, and they run that through an SVT, MPEG, and maybe an 1176 after it, or a distressor or something after it, and then they record that through a great preamp, that can be the tone, and you don't have to do anything to it. It's just the great classic tone. It works if it's done right. It's just you hit play and it just works. And all you have to do is balancing and maybe a touch of compression or whatever. But if that's the case, I won't touch it, because what would you do? What would you do to that? Like
Totally. And there's some songs where like a DI, a clean DI, the sound of a bass into a DI is the tone that you're looking for. It's just like that really simple, clunky thing, and that works perfectly. So sometimes it's just I grab that DI, maybe compress it a little bit, and it's done. Yeah,
especially if you're doing like pop rock or like softer things or some. I mean, indie can be. There are various, like there are some indie pop or indie rock things where this is the case as well. But then there's also the sort of indie rock where it's this muffled, almost like old strings sounding sort of distortion or dirty thing. But some of the indie pop or pop rock or softer rock stuff, where they often play with fingers instead of a pick as well, a clean DI with a great bass and a great player is all you need. It can work well. Just a touch of compression to control it a bit, and that's it.
Yeah, the point we're making is that, well, we like kind of splitting the bands on a bass and distorting stuff like that. We're very intentional with what we're doing. It's not just that this is how you do it. It's that it's how we get where we're actually trying to go. We're not just messing with it because that's the way. It's not the way. It's just a way of getting somewhere.
Yeah, and it's always good also to listen, of course, in context with everything else, and have the big picture, the vision in mind. Because, for example, if you are going for a really boomy, super big, super subby kick drum in a slow song, and the kick drum is very long, very subby, very big sounding, there's not much space in the very low end. So you probably don't need a super clean, super massive bass sound. You want to have a lot of low mid-range maybe above the kick drum to go together with the kick drum very well, and you might not need the massive low end. But if you have a very tight, very small sounding kick drum that's super punchy and tight but not very, very big, and there's a lot of space in the super low end, then you can fill all that in with the bass DI and the low end of that. So it's always a matter of context, and you should always keep that in mind.
Yes.
So yeah,
I want to give an honorable mention to MIDI Bass. Because I feel like it's worth mentioning. And MIDI Bass, for those not familiar, is just bass that you program in using, like, you could just do it with your mouse if you wanted, or a MIDI controller or whatever. works for your workflow. But the amp sound is generated from a plugin, and it's pretty awesome, in my opinion. I mean, there's definitely it's different, right? It doesn't really sound like a person, but it really sounds great. And in a mix, it can definitely do the job. I've got a guy that sends me stuff with MIDI bass every single time now, and it's been working fantastically. There's some stuff I have to do to try and make it sound more human in the mix, but it's totally possible. So if you're not up to the task of recording a great bass, don't want to buy bass strings very often, because we wouldn't be the Self-Recording Band podcast if we didn't tell you that you have to have fresh bass strings every time.
Yeah.
And that actually is expensive. So you might want to consider going with a MIDI bass, because it's way more affordable in the long run, and it is going to give you a great result.
Sure. Yeah, totally. Can't agree more. And depends. There are some absolutely fantastic MIDI bass instruments that give you a realistic sound, like the punk bass or the chin bass, or what's the other one from Submission Audio?
It's Eurobass.
Eurobass. Those three
Eurobass,
exactly are great for different things.
Yep.
So there's things like that. But there's also sometimes the built-in whatever bass instrument you have in your DAW or something can even work depending on how real it needs to be. If it's very simple and it's just the low end, the foundation, the root notes, something else can work as well. It's like, yeah, just try it. It can work surprisingly well even with cheap tools.
Yep, definitely. I actually really like receiving MIDI bass, because it lets me just kind of audition a bunch of different instruments. Like not only am I changing the amp, I'm changing the bass, which is really cool.
Yes.
TuneTrack just put out a really cool one that I feel like is worth mentioning, because it actually will write bass parts for you. So if you're like a singer-songwriter and just don't have the bass bone in you, you should really check it out. Because it can come up with ideas that spark, creativity.
Oh, totally. I don't know about that tool. I need to put that in show notes.
It's pretty new.
Okay. Is it like the virtual drummer in Logic that does that you can just jam to?
Pretty much.
Okay.
Yeah, and apparently you can you could just go through and play the bass notes with a guitar even, and it would be able to figure that out from that. So it can kind of, how Superior Drummer can detect a track. I think it's called Tracker.
Yeah.
It can detect what instrument's being played on the drum kit. It's that technology applied to a or to a monophonic source so it can track what notes are being played and make up a bass line based on what it's hearing. I'm sure it's not something you're going to use live, but it can get you started. So the fellow I know that's using it is a songwriter, and it's perfect for him. It's such a cool tool.
Sweet. I need to look into that and put it in the show notes. Awesome. Yeah, I mean, one thing that you can also do with MIDI bass is it gives you as a mixer freedom to enhance certain parts. That's also what I really like about it. So sometimes I just use all the things we've been talking about throughout this episode on the verses and bridges and intro and outro and everything. But in the chorus, I might add some subtle, more like a touch more sub bass, for example, a little more consistency, even more weight. And I just do that by if I have a MIDI bass, or sometimes I'll just program it myself. I'll just add, it can be a sine wave even, just the root note, like the very low end, the lowest octave, and I add that to the chorus to add a little more weight. And you don't even notice that there is a virtual instrument there or some sine wave generator, but it just makes the chorus a little bigger. So there's tricks you can do with MIDI bass that are cool. So yeah.
Absolutely. Sometimes we're going down the rabbit hole here, but just on the tips and tricks and MIDI bass is that if I had a song where we were tuned to drop D, I think, and the tuning and kind of just the consistency of that low drop tuned string, that note, the low D in this case, was just not sounding as good as the fretted notes. It just kind of lacked, and the pitch was all wonky too. So we literally programmed in all of the drop D notes on a MIDI bass, and the rest of it was the actual amp performance. And it just I just muted those on the bass on the real bass and made it one instrument, and it worked amazingly well.
Awesome. Yeah. I think. It's hard to believe that this stuff actually works, but I bet if you don't tell people, you just don't know. It's just
exactly.
Very cool, very cool. And in case you're wondering why we are talking about mid-range and distortion and character and all that stuff all the time, why that even is a thing and why that is important, because it's about bass, right? There is an episode of this podcast, it's episode number 12, and it's called Bass Tone is More Than Just Low End. So I would highly encourage you to listen to that episode, because then you'll learn more about why that mid-range, that distortion, that drive is even important and worth talking about, and why you might even need it or want it in genres that you typically wouldn't think of a distorted bass when you think about those genres. So just listen to that. We explain why that is important and why it's not just low end, and why new strings are important and why all of that. So listen to that episode. And then on the topic of generally like choosing bass tones and making decisions on what's the right bass tone for the song and making the low end of the song as a whole work, there's an article on the Self-Recording Band website, and it's called How to Get Your Low End Right Before Mixing. So it's about the low end and getting it right, but not the mixing techniques, but how to prepare your tracks, how to arrange them, how to capture them so that mixing will be a breeze and will make the life of your mixing engineer so much easier, or yourself if you're mixing. And if you want to read that, it's the selfrecordingband.com/low-end. Just go there, and it's a pretty extensive article where I explain the concepts of why I choose certain, the concepts behind why I choose certain bass tones and how I put the bass and kick together, why that relationship even matters, what else can be going on in the low end, how to get that right, how to make low end audible on small speakers, all that stuff is in there. So the selfrecordingband.com/low-end, there's where you find this article. That's the two additional resources that I want to leave you with after this episode.
Great. All right. Well, any final thoughts, or should we wrap it up?
I think we've pretty much covered it, right? These are our thoughts on bass. And again, if you're looking for recommendations, that's maybe the last thing to say here on what to buy. We pretty much summed it up in the during the episode. But if you already decided on buying an amp and you want a modern amp and you're wondering, should I get the whatever there is out there these days, I would say it doesn't matter as much, because all of these amps, what they aim to do is reproduce low end in a clean way, drive your speakers. They all have different EQs and maybe a compressor or not, but the main tone will always come from the instrument, maybe a pedal in front of it, and then the cab and the way you capture it. And the bass amp, unless it's an amp pack or some characteristic tube amp, unless it's that, it's just a way to amplify that signal. So I wouldn't worry too much. Buy something quality that has enough power to give you what you need on stage or to drive your cab or whatever, but don't worry too much. They all do the same, especially if it's clean transistor amps. So I wouldn't go crazy here and spend a bunch of time researching. It's not worth it.
Yeah, we didn't really drive home the importance of the bass you're using, and that is 90% of the picture is what bass you choose to play for the recording. It makes the biggest difference. That and fresh strings.
That and fresh strings, exactly. Yeah. Maybe we should do another episode on the topic of instruments themselves. I don't know. Maybe we could come up with that, because it is super important. But for now, with the amp versus DI versus cab episode, I think that's it. One thing, I just can't stop. One thing we just didn't mention, we didn't mention actually, it comes to mind now, is the type of microphone you would use to capture it.
Right.
That would be also a topic for another episode, but maybe really quick. I think depends on what you're wanting to get from the amp. So to make it super quick, a condenser will give you the low end, will give you the clarity, will give you an accurate representation of the cab. A dynamic will be more focused on the mid-range, probably, depending on which dynamic it is. You'll get more upper mid-range or lower mid-range, but it's a more gritty, tighter sounding mid-range focused thing. A ribbon can give you a nice low end with a top and roll-off. And then there is special things like kick drum mics that are pre-EQ'd that can give you an additional low-end boost maybe, but they can be scooped in the mid-range.
Right.
That's basically
it. I tend to lean towards the condenser mics these days.
Me too.
That's where I've ended up. It's like I want it to be accurate of what I'm hearing and try and get close to the tone I just dialed in. So that's the quickest way of getting there for me.
So basically, as a starting point, use whatever vocal mic you have and try putting that in front of the bass cab. Could be a condenser. Could also be something like the SM7 or so, but a condenser, basic vocal, whatever you use for vocals, try that on bass. It will probably work in the right spot. And then
and man, we can't stop. But if you're really going for it, I love an SM57 on it, but it's like, that's like the supplement mic for me. It's like a condenser, like a U47 I really dig, and then an SM57 snuck in there as well. Line up the capsules, make sure it's all phase goodness. And that's pretty tried and true.
Yeah. The ultimate recommendation for a self-recording band DIY podcast: go get a U47. Go. You just heard it. Malcolm,
all you need is $10,000 and you can get a good bass tone.
Yeah, exactly. Malcolm just said he basically wants you to spend $15,000 on a microphone because that's how you get a bass tone. But no. But if you can, if you have access to something like that, or a clone, or an emulation, or whatever, it is a great mic on basses. Absolutely.
Ignore that part of the podcast. Just get a good DI. That's all you need.
Okay. Great. Place to wrap it up here. Thank you for listening. See you next week.
See ya.